Hello, everybody. It is me, Josh. So, we finished methods at Norwich. I hope you guys can forgive um, my room at the moment. It's kind of messed up, and if you guys notice that my jaw's inflamed, I really don't know what's going on. I think I have an infected tooth or something. So if I'm like talking weird, then please ignore it. But that said, we are in week 11 at Norwich. I know I didn't make a video on a lot of the schools and stuff that we went over. Oh, God, that is noticeable, isn't it? Oh, well. So, I'm super self-conscious. Okay. Anyways, so the last 2 weeks... So I think the last video that I made was over either Marxism or the New Left. So from the New Left, we went to postmodernism, to feminist history, and stuff like that. They're both not so much feminist history and not so much the New Left, but postmodernism is really complicated. And so I'll probably have to do a bit more preparing if I want to do a video over that particular school of historical inquiry. Jesus. Especially when you get into their deconstruction of texts and then the background of Foucault, Derrida, and Lyotard. I don't fucking know how you say the French. But the final assignment for methods at Norwich was a 20 to 25 page historiography paper that was a topic of your choosing. And since I kind of had experience doing historiography for my senior thesis at Hanover over the Roman Empire, I just used the same books and texts that I already had. I had to order Peter Brown's The World of Late Antiquity 150 to 750, but other than that, I had a lot of the books already on hand. It had to be 5 books, and then 10 to 12, he preferred 12, supporting peer-reviewed articles, or book reviews didn't count, but he said that you could include them. And I'm playing Destiny in the background. I hope you guys don't mind. So the 5 books that I used was obviously Gibbon, volumes 1 and 2, which I actually, if you guys will give me just a second, I have all of them right here. So the books that I used for this particular project was the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the Penguin edition. This is volume 1 and 2 put together. This was a particular pain in the ass because I knew that to actually do the historiography of the fall of the Roman Empire, it wasn't really plausible given the time that I had, so I decided to focus on the decline and fall of the Western Roman Empire, which still required me to get through just about all of this. And then I did some supplemental readings because I knew I wasn't going to be able to get through all of it, but we got through it, and I honestly think that I allowed Gibbon to kind of dominate the narrative, but I treated Gibbon as sort of a base by which other arguments were built off of, and I mean, that's kind of the situation given historiography of the Roman Empire, especially if you want to use sort of a broad spectrum analysis and not just localized histories like Aurelius Victor or Ammianus or some of the other Greek or Islamic authors. I mean, Zanaris, Eutropius, stuff like that. So we started with this, we worked our way through that one, and then we also, it went in a chronology. I thought it would be kind of a good or a better paper if I went in chronological order, given the arguments and sort of interpretive views as the years went on. And so after Gibbon, we went to Burckhardt, and for Burckhardt I used The Age of Constantine the Great. I think this is the University of California Press version. Yeah, this is the Pantheon Books. So I apologize. It's the 49 edition. I had this book ever since I took Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, 393 at Hanover. It's okay. He kind of introduced the view that well, I mean, it started with Gibbon, but he sort of solidified the view that Constantine was essentially just a charlatan, not a real Christian, and used Christianity as sort of a trampoline of sorts for political opportunism. But the important aspects of this book was that it really solidified the changing roles of the emperors and the failed policies of that begun with Aurelian, and then were introduced with Diocletian, and then failed after Diocletian and Maximian abdicated after their 20-year terms, and then we eventually come to Constantine after he kills most of his families, and then you sort of see the evolutionary role of really the central focus of the Roman Empire moving away from the West into the East, and especially with the growth and adoption of widespread Christianity and so on and so forth. So that was the main contribution of Burckhardt. I'm trying to forget. I think that there's a central aspect of Burckhardt too. Oh, so yeah. The issue of Diocletian. So another thing that I took from this is that not so much that he ever directly mentions it, but one of the aspects of my thesis work that I did when I did my undergraduate thesis over Aurelian was that Aurelian, again, without... Okay, so Aurelian didn't actually address it, but one of the central issues of the Roman Empire, from Augustus just onward, is that there was never any institutionalized method for secession within the Roman Empire. It usually came down to two factors. One was Senate popularity, and then the support of the troops. Well, by the late second century and essentially through the rest of Roman history, that the support of the Senate just didn't really matter. It was who had the support of the troops, because the troops, the legions, especially into the 3rd century, really became more conscientious of their power and role, and actually putting people on the throne and anointing them to the Roman purple. And so that was another aspect of the decline and fall of the West that I really included into, because the legions and this sort of realization of the power, the general's realization of this power, caused many of them to pursue their own personal goals and glory and sort of abdicate their responsibilities elsewhere. And so especially during, again, the 3rd, with the military anarchy crisis and the mass barbarian invasions, especially in the later 3rd century after the plague, the Cyprian plague of 251, I mean, it just caused irreparable damage to both frontier territories and already strained logistics and agriculture and just Rome in general. So that was Burckhardt's contribution. And then after Burckhardt, we came to the more controversial of the 5, and that is Henri Paren. Now, Paren introduced something known as the Paren thesis, in which he stated that it wasn't necessarily the barbarian invasion or the mass barbarian invasion of the 3rd century that really did the Western Roman Empire in. And to him, the Western Roman Empire survived in a Germanified form centuries after the 3rd century. And the Germans, to Paren, didn't necessarily have a bone to pick with the Romans. They actually were quite apt to emulate Roman society because they appreciated it. They cared for it. They didn't have widespread religious differences. Most of them were still pagan. I mean, you had the later Arian Goths and stuff like that. But the reason that the Germanic invaders sort of pushed inward at the extent that they did, especially in the 5th century with the burning of Rome in 410 under Alaric, was that the Huns were right behind them. And so that's what really caused the German incursions into the Western Roman Empire, not so much any real axe to grind on behalf of the Germans towards the Romans. And then what really did the Western Roman Empire in is, this is what's known as the parenthesis, is the mass Islamic expansions of the 7th and 8th century. And so, according to Paren, the Germans, who were more than willing to adopt Roman culture and sort of imitate it in a very Germanified sense, this aspect was not true with the Islamic invaders. So they sort of instilled their own religious, traditional, and social norms into territories that they conquered, and into the 7th and 8th century, as more and more Germanic territories and greater Islamic expansion, even the Western Roman Empire in a Germanified form sort of ceased to be. And then another aspect that was central to his thesis is that with these Islamic incursions, the Roman world, which was united by the Mediterranean, it sort of lost control of the Mediterranean, and this vital trade route fell apart. And so any hope of maintaining even a Germanified West was further sort of went the way of the dodo, so to speak. So that was Paren in a nutshell. And then after Paren, in terms of chronology, I actually broke the chronology here because I wanted to continue the narrative of decline and fall before I introduced a more contrarian point with Peter Brown. But the next book that we utilized was, and I really like this book, by the way. It's one of the more modern introductions. It's Kyle Harper's The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire. And so this is essentially a catalog of Roman history using modern climate and pathobiological analysis from really the 2nd century onward, where the central thesis of this book could find her summary in the fact that Rome, from the later BCs all the way into the 2nd century or the later 2nd century, they really experienced just an ideal climate not only for agriculture and avoidance of major plagues, but as time went on, given the disposition and overexpansion of the Roman Empire, Rome essentially made itself into a giant petri dish, especially for widespread plagues, and the Roman people were just generally unhealthy, and so their susceptibility to new and unseen disease was significantly higher than originally anticipated. At the end of the 2nd century and into the 3rd century, those idealistic climate conditions really went to the wayside. You had widespread famines in the major granaries in North Africa. You saw major droughts in Egypt, which was a vital lifeline to the Roman Empire. And then into the military anarchy crisis aspect of it, after both the Gallic secessionists and the Palmyran secessionists under Zenobia cede away, even Egypt operating a limited capacity was still sort of breathing life into the empire, sort of leaves with Palmyra until it's reunited by Aurelian. And this becomes immensely problematic because essentially during the 3rd century, when you have widespread barbarian invasion, no real sense of either functioning government, and the legions aren't defending your frontier territories, you have droughts and major agricultural damage in North Africa and Egypt. What also happens is there's an outbreak of plagues, and given, as I've stated, that the Roman populace was just generally unhealthy, this sort of eats its way through the empire in a way that was never thought possible. You see it first with the Antiquity plague in the 160s, I think 165. And then after that, the really big one was the Antiquity plague, but the second big one was the Cyprian plague that started around 249. I think the first case was around 249 or 250. And Gibbon, I think before his chapter over Aurelian and Claudius, he mentions that a register was kept at Alexandria, and you were looking at 50% casualties in not only major frontier territories, but in major cities. And I mean, this is absolutely insane amounts of casualty rates, especially given the situation that they were in at this time during the 250s. So you had the military anarchy crisis, barbarian invasion, famine, Germanic incursions near Italy, so near Rome around this time. So Harper does a really good job of focusing on climate change, disease in this book, and so I incorporated that into the further deterioration of the Western Empire. And so, again, I kind of broke chronology with Harper, but the last inclusion, again, and probably the most interesting in terms of narrative sense, was Peter Brown's The World of Late Antiquity. And this one is the Norton and Company edition. So it's relatively newer. I think this was 88 or 89. Yeah. This book actually takes a contrarian view to the other four. So it agrees with the sense that the West endured, in a sense, much like Paren said, but it looks at what Paren posits as the world of late antiquity. So it wasn't necessarily decline or fall, but when you look at the coins, they had inscriptions that said things like restorer of the world, which I really do think that he misread that and was looking at coins that survived from Aurelian because that was his title. But again, I'm not Peter Brown, and I haven't really done my research into that, but that just seems to be what he's getting at. Or the Age of Restoration was another big one. And so Brown posits that no culture or society that's experiencing widespread catastrophe would ever put coins that had insinuations like this into widespread circulation. And then he also argues, looking at, his litany of other physical tradition or physical evidence that survives, that you really have more so an evolution during this period than a decline and fall and just generalized catastrophe during this period. And so it's sort of a contrarian viewpoint. It doesn't necessarily see the later days of the Western Empire, especially after it falls to Alaric in 410 and sort of exists in a Germanified form, as really a negative. Now, he does concede that certain aspects existed in sort of a Neo-Latin form and weren't anything like they were under their Roman predecessors, or their more Roman predecessors under the Antonine emperors, but kind of like Gibbon does. where Gibbon sort of posits that after the Antonine dynasty, everything goes to shit. But it's a good book. I think that he generalizes just a little bit, and I do think he takes quite a rosy view of a lot of things. A lot of people seem to think that he devalues economic evidence, and I would almost agree with them. I think that he sort of characterizes evidence in a very overgeneralized or generalized sense in many instances, but I think that his central argument is fair. Again, he would go on. I think he's still alive, actually. I mean, he's a pretty serious historian, so I think that this was just an introduction to his arguments that he sort of supported as time went on. But yeah, so that was the 5 books we used, and I'm not going to rattle off all the articles that I used, but in terms of paper length, I think mine ended up being about 23 and a half pages, plus about 3 pages for the bibliography, because I found a whole bunch of other articles that I wanted to use as sort of cross-analysis or cross-analyze the authors to find both the positive and the negative reactions to their central arguments. And I did pretty well. I ended up getting a 90% of the paper, and which was surprising, because I kind of thought that it was, after I had done my revisions, I thought it was a very solid B paper. I didn't think very much of it. I did kind of wait to finish, especially Harper and Brown near the end there, and I felt like I was generalizing their arguments in a limited sense. But no, that's it. I think if everything goes well, I'll probably end my first semester at Norwich with about a 92% for the methods class, which isn't bad at all. I'm quite happy with that. I ended my first semester at Indiana University East with a 95.67% and then a 95.38% in both my classes. And then I start summer classes May the 25th, so Monday. So that's that. I don't think I start the second class MH520, so Revolutionary History or Early American and Revolutionary History, until I think June. So it gives me a couple weeks to really sort of dive into the reading material before it's actually due, just to kind of get a head start on things. But yeah, I'll try and do regular videos. I don't think I'm going to be doing like update videos by chapter. Wow, that's incredibly disappointing.